Hello, everybody. Hi. It's my pleasure. Hi.
That's a nice word. My pleasure.
Yeah. It's my pleasure to introduce Boris Koichuk. It's not only because he was my PhD advisor and true mentor, but also because of the main result. So Boris is the head of Mathematics Education Research and Development Group in the Faculty of Science and Technology Education in Israel Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. Boris focuses his research on learning and learning for and learning through mathematical problem solving, and his talk today will be where can solution ideas come from. So I've just made this introduction as short as possible. And
thank you very much, and that's what I asked for. It's a great pleasure to come to visit Berkeley and be introduced by your former, and it's happy to say so, PhD student, and congratulations to Alec, who just a week or so became a PhD.
I'm getting applause.
It is also a great honor to give this talk here for many reasons, and one of them because somehow I dare to talk about problem solving in a place that is internationally known as a home of very important research on problem solving. So let's try. It will take some time in my talk to make this question, where can solution ideas come from, operational and researchable. It will not be done in one stage, but let's begin from something very simple. Warming up. I guess that we can recognize this very simple, for us, puzzle, but when we think about this solution, I'll read it for a moment. The squares below are built from 12 matches. Remove 2 matches so that only 2 squares would remain. Let's say that we have these several moments about to recall this solution, or probably to think about solution if somebody don't remember it immediately. And then, when we see the solution, how would we answer to ourselves to this question? Where can the solution idea come from? Any options? To us, to our students, to our children, grandchildren? Let me come back. This is a problem, this is the solution. It's very simple, and I think that most of us just remember that once somebody told, or I've seen in a book, or probably I've thought for several moments, and then, aha, I remove these 2, and somehow the problem is solved. But do we have any memories about that first time for us? Where can the solution, where did the solution come from? Thank you. It's very difficult to begin interaction, we know.
Yeah. The first time I solved that problem, I looked at it and said, well, obviously there has to be a trick in some sense. Where have I seen problems where I've had to think out of the box? And the answer was in problems where either it was 3-dimensional while I was thinking of it as 2-dimensional, or objects were of different sizes. And as soon as I got to that, except I didn't do it consciously, it was, oh, if I don't think about the squares being the same size, then it's easy. Mm-hmm. So that was the space I was wandering in, although how it actually got connected, I can't tell you.
Quoting you, you considered some available schemata and gave subjective values to each option, and from them, by some parsimony principle, you probably chosen the most simple, or most available, or most appealing way to solve.
That gives me more credit than I give myself.
I guess that there are less chances that you are familiar with this problem. Probably you do, probably you don't. Let's think about this one for a moment. A square is divided into 9 equal squares as shown on the drawing. prove that two angles denoted on the drawing are equal. And those are two angles. Our time is very limited. You have 30 seconds to begin thinking, to think how would you think if given time about this problem. Spoils the fun, because it's not the point now to solve about this problem. Would anybody like to share what was going on in these several seconds when you just look at the problem? And please speak those who wasn't familiar with it, those for whom this problem was really new, because I didn't invent it. It appears in many geometry textbooks. Yes, please. Your name?
I'm Quinn.
Quinn.
I tried to think back to my 9th grade geometry class. Didn't really remember too much from that, but just trying to figure out how to piece all together the missing angles and then translate them down to that one down there. But I didn't figure out exactly. I didn't finish my
you were
thought
trying
process.
to remember something from your previous experiments when in school you studied geometry course.
Exactly.
Okay, okay. Anybody else? Dor?
Yep. Some bottom-up stuff going on, some top-down going on, and trying to negotiate. I was bottom-up, I was looking across and what can I see here that are things, and maybe I can see more than one of those things, and maybe how they relate, and then
theorems? What are things?
objects.
Objects.
Particular
Okay.
objects. Okay,
Okay.
that diagonal line. Maybe if I twist it, is it the same? What can I do with it? But there was a lot of first finding out what are the its, what are the things I want to look at. But also asking, okay, what do I know about such situations, and what can I use?
Again, I'm stretching like I did with your answer, but probably you see this as an object that can be divided in some way into smaller objects, and some of them are more relevant to the solution, and some of them are less relevant solutions. So we see some tree of choices. You can go here or there depending on. Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, and
Your name?
Emily.
Emily.
In the first few seconds, I just kind of tried to take the bottom one and like mentally move it to place it in a orientation where it'd be easier to compare the two.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, please remember somehow these several moments when we attempted to solve something new and reflected on this experience, because it would be a good starting point for quite a heavy theory that I'm going to introduce in several moments. We come back to the title of my talk, and I allow myself very briefly, just because I'm in Berkeley, to show one or two slides about how I see problem solving as a subfield of mathematics education research. It's a very subjective account, but I think that in this room we would easily agree that problem solving is an activity which is very important both in studying and doing mathematics. And from the history of problem solving research in mathematics, we know that it is originated in such writings like writings of George Poya and other prominent mathematicians. The distinction between learning, wait, what did I do? The distinction between learning for and learning through problem solving is also historical. To the best of my knowledge, it was made by Schroeder and Lester in 1989, and it denotes what later became a big issue, what for we are trying to incorporate problem solving in school programs. For the sake of the problems, because problems are important and we want to know how to solve them, or by means of problem solving, we want to do something else. And this is a distinction between learning for and learning through problem solving. Very subjective, but I see problem solving research as a research of phenomenological nature. It is mostly about phenomena we observe, and we think about subjective ways of how can different people perceive this phenomena. So, simply put, problem-solving research is mostly data-anchored. It uses quite parsimonious, I would say, conceptual framework in comparison with, say, what is done with problem-solving in cognitive science. So the number of new words that we introduce in order to talk about problem-solving is, in my opinion, probably quite parsimonious in comparison with other fields. And of course, it was very strange for me. I'm at the department of, the faculty of Education, Technology and Science, so we have people who are interested in problem solving in mathematics, physics, chemistry. And we come together, it appears that we are trying, we use in our theoretical frameworks very different names. So somehow the tradition to referring to accumulating knowledge is quite specific in this field. Another point is, of course, distinction. Here I'm quoting a known paper by Jeremy Kilpatrick, but he was not the first to point it out, that we are talking about the distinction between problem and exercise. The difference is that a problem is a task which the solution method is not known in advance. And this, of course, gives us this well-known fact of relativity of what counts for the problem. I cannot just take a problem from, I don't know, International Mathematical Olympiad and claim that it is a problem, because probably somebody already knows how to solve it, and it would not be a problem. And for somebody else, this problem is too complicated that he would even be engaged in the beginning with this problem. So for him or her, it would also not be a problem. A related point is that all the issue of relativity of what counts for a problem and what for exercise is that problem solving by definition is about inventing rather than recalling the solution. And I know that this distinction is not precise, because inventing can probably be based on recalling and combination of recalled things. I would say that recalling is not enough in order to solve the problem. And here we enter what is known as creativity paradox, a method which once has been taught stops being creative and become routine. It's also related. In Israel, sometimes the word problem is reserved to word problems, story problems. And just to stress that problem can become, and that almost anything can become a problem in mathematics, just several very brief examples. I guess that even if we not momentarily know the answer to this exercise, I cannot say that it is a problem, but it is a problem for somebody who doesn't know how to solve it and think about it. And it was very distinct phenomenon in our study with Daniel Bourret, 2008, when this problem was given to, among other computational tasks, to a group of 12 graders with a very, who could be defined as underprivileged or in mathematics, for whom it was a problem. And those who agreed to cooperate with us and to think about these exercises, they invented quite creative shortcuts and methods and way of how to do these computations. So for them it was a problem, not an exercise. These two I used about 10 years ago in a series of clinical interviews with middle school students in Israel. And I know that for them it was a problem. Students who approached this equation after they learned in their classroom how to solve a similar but not exactly the same equation, of course knew that they can cancel fractions and it is 1 minus 1 equals 0. But they have never experienced this solution to an equation, because equation you do manipulations, and finally arrive at x equals. Here x is disappeared and it became a real problem. This one was given to students of A grade who saw the definition of n factorial for the first time, and it was given in writing without any explanation. So for them, it was an exclamation mark, some strange symbol, which is this, and they were asked to find this. 24 is the answer. What can go wrong here? For them, it was a very interesting problem-solving process. For most of them, I'm talking about a group of about 60 students. Well, I have a new definition. I should somehow understand it better. So what's reasonable to do? Examples. So what is 2 exclamation mark 2? What is 3 exclamation mark 6? What is 4 exclamation mark 24? 5 exclamation mark 120. 6 exclamation mark 720. Enough. I understand. Okay, now I can approach this task. But it would be silly not to use the result that I've already obtained when trying to understand the definition. So about 80% of these students substituted 6 factorial with 720, substituted 4 factorial with 24, so on and so forth, and this exercise became for them a much more complicated problem than it is for us. Again, it is about relativity of exercise versus problem distinction. And this one we recently explored in one of the quite advanced calculus course with the students of the Technion. And it was a problem for strong students who again approached it by trying to apply schemata that worked in similar situations. But this particular task is chosen so that a proof by induction in the form that they applied it in 10th similarly looking problem before just didn't work. And they tried for something that they know, they actualized what they know, but it became a problem from some point. The point is that I wanted to say that this can be a problem and this can be an exercise. Everything is depending on the content. So from here we have 2 challenges, practical and theoretical. And my talk contains 2 quotes, 2 long quotes, sorry. This is the first one. I choose to quote from one of the recent papers of Shlomo Wiener, who says very strongly, because of the currently prevalent educational policy, passing the mathematical exam has become the top priority of teachers and students. The main goal of teaching is therefore to prepare the students to pass the exam. This is done by providing the students with a toolbox by means of which they are supposed to be able to solve the mathematical problems presented to them in homework, assignment, and on tests. Such problems should be routine problems or routine problems under disguise. Why? Because it is unfair to present on examination a problem for which there does not exist a solution strategy in the students' books. Then Shlomo makes a very strong case that all our attempts to incorporate real problem solving in a school setting is probably meaningless, and we just cannot achieve this goal, and he builds quite a convincing case in this paper. For me, it's rather not a statement but a question, because I'd like to consider it more positively and to ask how to create room for problem solving in school reality. The second quote is from Alan. I'm sorry, it's a little embarrassing, but this is what I used to do in many papers when I write about problem solving. Okay, let's put it this way. I'll ask you, are you agree? After that, I'll read it. My work today has examined problem solving through the lens of the individual at any point in time. The question has been how and why does the individual go about making decisions in the service of some problem solving goals, given that he or she knows. There are serious limitations. First, the focus on what is happening in the moment ignores questions of learning and development. Second, individuals do not work or learn in a vacuum. At minimum, a theory of learning and cognition that explains how ideas grow and are shared in interaction is crucial. There is much to be done on the theoretical front. Thank you. But for me, it is also, again, some impetus for asking a question about what specifically can be done. And this time, I think in this direction. Actually, we know a lot about several aspects of problem solving. We also know quite a lot about interactions. So for me, it becomes rather a question of coordinating insights rather than reinventing insights that we can find when beginning reading different types of research in mathematics education. So, very briefly, I think that today we know a lot about problem solving phases and attributes. But you hardly know how they come to cohere, and again it's close to citation. We know how to explain problem-solving failures and successes, but hardly know how to explain them in more complicated cases. I think that examples that we use in studies of problem-solving very convincingly explain failures. We can explain that this person didn't solve this problem because he didn't have enough knowledge or strategic knowledge, or he didn't believe that it is worthwhile trying. But if we have a person, a given person who solves one problem and doesn't solve another problem, it can be more difficult to point out which of the problem-solving attributes was missing here. We need something else. We know about controversial long-term effects of problem-solving because they are not always possible. We're all good in producing more than 80% of population who then the rest of the life is afraid of problem-solving. And we hardly know how one's problem-solving skills develop. And then I'd like to give credit to a huge branch of research about interactions, classroom interactions around many problem-solving tasks. And to say that we know a lot about characteristics of problem-solving interactions and discourse, but we hardly know how they enter one's individual pathway when somebody solves a problem in a group. We can characterize interactions in a group, but say how these group interactions help this particular person to produce or not produce an idea, it's something else. And here, with reference to Jerry Golden, I would like to say that one of the methodological obstacles in our attempts to progress the state of the art is the distinction he made in the field of affect. It is about traits and states. Traits are more constant characteristics. States are about what's going on in the moment. And in one of his papers, he says that any attempt to explain states solely in terms of traits is deficient. We just cannot do it. We cannot just say that there are some constant parameters that can always explain what's going on in the solution of a particular problem. Having this said, I decided to invest some thought into creating a puzzle, creating a particular combinations of insights from different theories that probably would be instrumental, at least for me, in doing this thing. This slide is about several limitations that I see personally when I try to adhere to a particular problem-solving model. Because every problem-solving model is based on a particular set of data, it usually works very well within the context that the model was created. But from my personal experience, when I try to adapt one model from one situation to socially different situation, it somehow becomes difficult and sometimes even impossible because you begin stretching the original categories too far. So this is the challenge, and here the practice. The next about 15 minutes, I'm going to spend to one example, and by means of this example, I'll make my point that I'm going to make. So, the idea is to somehow to document and explain the emergence of problem-solving ideas in a fairly realistic learning environment. This is the goal. To do so, we need such an environment, not in the lab, but in school. But we remember words of Shlomo Wiener, who says how difficult it is to find in school a real opportunity for problem-solving that would include invention. So after some thinking, we decided to adapt / create / find such an environment and to use a combination of classroom and online activities with the purpose to prolong periods of time that can be devoted to solution of particular challenging problems. In real problem solving, you cannot guarantee that the solution would appear in 45 minutes or in 90 minutes. Sometimes you need less, sometimes you need more. And to have this opportunity, not necessarily to close each lesson with successful solution, we devised some learning environment in which a combination of classroom and online activity was proposed. A study I will talk about, and here I'd like to stop and thank Israel Science Foundation for supporting this study, was in this situation, 10th grade, imagine a 10th grade, 16-year-old students who sometimes begin solving a problem in a classroom, and they are accustomed to a situation that it is not a tragedy if they will not finish in a classroom, because they can continue from home, and not alone as a regular homework, but continue their interactions with peers around the solution of this problem. In this way, we call it long-term problem solving, having in mind that these processes can last for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Then, from the need, this process can be continued to the next lesson. This is the situation. There are sources of data, and I'll use an example in order to present how the data were analyzed. I'm very happy to mention the many people in research group who work in this project, including Ira Palati, who was an active member of the group for the first year. And I'm very happy to stress that 3 persons who were involved during the first year of the project only as teachers who collaborated with the research group became also the researchers. They now not only teachers in the classes of whom the activity is done, but also active researchers. And I will focus on an example from a teacher named, wonderful teacher, her name is Nelly Kell. Example, a problem. Again, a moment for mathematics. 2 circles with centers M and N are given. Tangent lines are drawn from the center of each circle to another circle. The point of intersection of the tangent line with the circle define 2 chords, EF and GH. We're supposed to prove that the chord EF equals GH. And I know that the drawing is not convenient. It is given exactly in the form that it was given to the students to encourage them to create their own drawings and not to do what they frequently do when having ready-made drawings in the textbooks. Those are examples, but we're not supposed to be now in the process of solving this problem. Let's say that this is a more convenient drawing. I'll tell in a moment the solution of this problem. I know that it is confusing when you just look at these many lines on the drawing. But my point is that I'd like to introduce some concepts from the conceptual framework I'm going to use by means of this example. So, for the moment, it is all right that we don't see the solution. We are not supposed to. Don't spoil the fun. Don't see the solution, please, right now. A central concept in the theoretical framework that I'm going to present is a concept of a key solution idea. A key solution idea is a heuristic idea that evokes in its inventor the conviction that the idea can be mapped to a full solution to the problem. It is very close to heuristic ideas or heuristic strategies, but not any heuristic strategy by this definition is a key solution idea. I think I have one attempt, another attempt, but then, wow, there is a flash, and somehow I become convinced that this particular auxiliary construction would solve me the problem. Is it correct or not? It's not important, but with this particular idea, I have the feeling that from here I can complete the problem. This one is, I call it a key solution idea. And the theoretical stand that we take in this line of research is that invention of a key solution idea is seen as a shift of attention in a pathway of the solver's shift of attention. How can this idea come to our mind? Generally speaking, I didn't see it a moment ago. Then my attention moved to another object, and probably the same object, but I've seen it in another light. And wow, I have this idea. And right now, I can allow myself to do the first iteration in operationalizing this general question, when can ideas come from? Because if we use this construct, we'll have we can formulate our question of interest a little more precisely. It's not the final formulation, but a little more precisely. Through which activities and resources can a pathway of shift of attention towards an invention of a key solution idea to a mathematical problem be constructed by a problem solver in socially different educational situations? This is the first iteration. This is not the, still not researchable question, but it is a little more researchable than the first one. And here, I should say a few words about structures of attention as presented by John Mason for a different purpose. He introduced these categories for explaining the process of creating abstractions, and Alec and I adapted it to some other needs. John Mason introduces 5 structures of attention. The claim is that when I'm looking at one object, I can do it in different ways. For example, this is our object, this complicated drawing. And for a second, I think that reason would suggest that we don't recognize details in this drawing, but just perceive it as something big on the board with 2 circles, something like that. Another structure of attention is discerning detail. If I give more time, let's say 30 seconds of silence, it would naturally appear that somebody would concentrate probably on this circle, and somebody else on this circle, and somebody else on K. So we would begin to see details in addition to the, not in addition, the whole would be split into a bunch of details if this is our structure of attention at the moment. The third one is that we look at the picture a little more and begin to think about the relationships between these details. Well, let's do it. What can I see here? Okay, it looks like a right-angled triangle. This is a relationship. This one is also a right-angled triangle. I think a little more. Are they related? Are they similar? What can happen to them? So if we gaze at the picture a little more, we not just list the details that we see, but we look for the relationships between these things. And then we can begin to perceive properties. One is aware of the possible property and looks for its element that may fit. A moment ago I suggested that these two are similar. And they are. Vertical angles and right angles. Similarity. Good idea. Are there other similar triangles here? So having in mind this selected property, I'm trying to purposely find additional elements of the picture that would fit this property. And let's say that somebody gave me a hint and says me in secret that, okay, similarity of triangles is what's important for solving this solution. So now, having this in mind, I really begin to find a right pair of these similar triangles. And having them in mind, I'm trying to continue. I know that my next step somehow should be based on this similarity. This is what John Mason calls selected properties are attended to as the only basis for further reasoning. I chose the property and now I count on it. I'm trying to continue from this place and not from another place. Here it's a good opportunity to really show you the solution. Again, the initial drawing is 2 circles, these 2 lines, tangent lines, and these 2 lines. What we are supposed to prove that EF equals GH. The catch is that when we need to prove that 2 segments are equal, and we are thinking about our standard geometry courses, we are trying to include them all in congruent triangles, or in some opposite sides of parallelogram, and so on and so forth. And this red rectangle would be very helpful if we would know how to prove that it is a rectangle. The catch is that it is very difficult to prove, much more difficult than to solve the problem. And on several solutions, my favorite one is this. I do consider similarity and say that Q, G, N is similar to N, M, A. In the same manner, I said that M, E, P is similar to M, C, N. And if I was so smart that I considered these two pairs of triangles, now I can just write the proportion and conclude the solution. So I spoiled the fun completely because what is interesting is to find it, but this is not our goal. I'll show you how this fun was enacted with a group of students in a moment. So this is the key slide of my presentation. This is what I'm going to illustrate with the particular examples. Capitalizing upon John Mason's framework and idea of shifts of attention, and employing, in a moment I will show how, additional theories related to problem solving, we attempt to give a very simple answer to the question, where can solution ideas come from? They can come from as a shift of attention, this is Mason's idea, but where from? It can be individual effort. I saw problem solving individually, and here we have several models of problem solving which are very helpful, including Alan's model. And a situation of interactions we split in this moment into two cases. The first one is interactions with those who don't know how to solve the problem. There is a group of students, nobody knows, we think together, and this is one kind of interactions. In these interactions, I'll talk a little later about mechanisms, a solution idea, a key solution idea can emerge from interaction, but can also be buried by this interaction. We'll see examples. And separately, we consider the case when key solution idea comes as a shifting from interaction with a solution source. And I don't mean the last page of the textbook, and I don't mean a teacher who's supposed to give a key. Let's say that we work in a group, and Alik gives me a hint that he solved the problem. From this moment, my problem-solving behavior probably will be changed, because I try to ask Alik a smart question in order to obtain the hint. Behavior, when I count on myself and peers, and we are in the same position, nobody knows, is one thing. And our interactions, when I know that a source of knowledge is around, is another thing. This is a distinction that we make in the model. And now an example. This is the second iteration, the second attempt to make the question, where can ideas come from, more operative. First, we want to characterize the situation. In Goldman's term, we are talking about traits of the problem, of the situation of the students. And then we really try to talk about states, but not only in terms of traits, but answering quite specific questions stipulated by the theory of shifts of attention. What are some objects of attention for the solver? How does the solver attend each object? Why does the solver move from one object of attention to another? It is the most speculative part. We have some criteria how to do it. And based on which resources are the object attended. When we are able, in these rare situations, when the data is good enough and our incentives, we have enough time to do so, in cases when we are able to answer all this list of questions for a particular situation, we say, okay, now we know where the solution idea came from. An example. The problem that I produced a moment ago was given to a group of 10 graders at the lesson, and then they continued from the floor. Let me just read several pages, several slides of the real interactions translated from Hebrew to English. Teacher, 4 in the morning, 4 a.m. This is when she begins. Good week, everybody. Today we begin to work on the third part of the project. Good luck. Somebody sounds like it was done in Google Plus. Shira, look guys if you understand anything in the drawing, but this is in general the direction that they took. She created some drawing and placed it in this Google Plus without any further explanation. The truth is that I also thought about this at the beginning, but how can we develop it? Somebody asks. Teacher, good evening, Shira. If you need to draw many segments, it is worthwhile to use colors. In my opinion, it helps. Zila, post also your thoughts, then you two can think together. I have some progress. The same student in 40 minutes places another drawing, and it is very difficult to understand what the difference with the first one. It looks just similarly, but it's meaningful for Claude. How the quadrilateral, this one, you said it is a parallelogram. I think it doesn't matter how the drawing looks like. I just did not draw exactly. But this is in general the direction, and you are invited to continue. I began working on the exercise only now, and your actual construction is exactly what I drew even without looking. Do you know this sign? Well, we've studied that besides of likes that we all know, there are many, many subtle ways to express emotions. It's not just pose like or dislike. This particular one, and no textbook and no teacher could tell me, this is just information from the students, that I am proud. Not just like I am proud, I'm showing that I am proud of this thing. Did you read the conclusion that this is a parallelogram? There's a good chance that it is. So far, I got a sketch, and I'll begin thinking in a moment. You're invited to continue. Unfortunately, I'm too tired to think. I saw that there was no file to download a clear picture, so I prepared one file for myself, D. You see the sign? This is another thing I am very proud. I contributed. I don't know how to solve the problem, but nobody created a good picture. So I invested my time, took Word, I don't think that it was GeoGebra, and created this picture. Use it. This is my gift to you. Good luck to all of us. And immediately we have a wave of thanks in very different shapes and forms. Thanks, appreciation, my pleasure. She is a hero for this moment. Then teacher enters and says, good evening, I recommend everyone to make a big colorful drawing. Maya, this was a student from the previous slide, I did succeed to download the drawing. I hope that the rest of the girls understand these matters better. As what to, and she enlisted all the names personally. She talking personally with everybody. What do you think? Go ahead, girls, share your thoughts. Okay, sharing your thoughts. Shira, the teacher, she called her Nelly. In Israel, teachers are usually called by their first name, but in English it doesn't sound good, so we translated it the teacher. Maya and I talked about by phone for about 15 minutes about the exercise and thought and got something. We heard understood that the key points are those points that define the given arcs. So the auxiliary constructions should be from them, or they should be included in two triangles, so it will be possible to prove their congruence. Well, some heuristic thought about what auxiliary construction could be needed here. Excellent. They continue and continue and continue. I will not read everything. I think that we've got general picture. All this interaction increase, but not everybody with everybody. They become selective. And the culmination was related to that student named Maya, who proposed for this computerized picture, then was very active in several threads, then disappeared from the forum for several hours, and then announced that she solved the problem.
Is it the third day of their...
It was some detail in the moment.
Because
This is, I think this slide is from the third day, but we'll get to the fourth day of solution of the problem. We were amazed, astonished, surprised, especially because Maya, she was not known as a good student in geometry. But let me focus on her. I stopped reading these slides and let me focus on specifically one student, because one thing that we had when we got this sort of data is it is enormously difficult to make sense of all the processes and all the things that are going on in there. So just a methodological decision was to focus on some students, and our natural first choice was Maya, who solved the problem and surprised everybody. So, what do we know about Maya from this forum? First of all, we know that she was very active. She invested about 5 hours to solving the problem. I forgot to mention that besides some of my claims, I based not on the information from the forum, but on reflective questionnaire and a stimulated recall conversation with focus students. So we know this about her, and we know that nearly 25% of everything that was in the forum was from her. She was very engaged. She uploaded several files, and this is an example of how we try to implement the theoretical framework that I presented in that slide, shift of attention, where they come from, in practice in case of Maya. So the data is coded by objects in the focus of attention, suggestions about structures of attention, and suggestions about resources based on all the things that we have. I know that even this is not the final result of the analysis. It's on the way, and I think that it would be more friendly to look at this one, which is summary of the previous one. So in this particular case, we can explain how did Maya invent this solution idea. It's not always happened. We can follow her attempts from here to here, and what is more interesting is that we can see when some idea was shared or invented together. We can see the moments of interaction in a situation when neither Maya nor Shira knew that this is a helpful idea. But it was some idea that they discussed together. They didn't know is it good or bad, so they left it, they returned it, one of them returned it. They became somehow in conflict in the middle because they chose different directions. And all this we can show how it happens in this particular process. And finally, just to make it easy, I say that they thought together about some idea that didn't work. Then somebody else entered idea that finally worked, but they didn't know it, and the proposal didn't know it either. Then they tried separate ways and faced several dead ends, but separate dead ends. They separated in their search. They were not working together. In a moment, not in a moment, in 2 hours, Maya came back to previously reduced idea, and that idea finally worked. This is the more general account that I can give right now. Well, how so? Some reflective thoughts about this process. We observed, we suggest that we can interpret Maya's action in terms of small variations. There were not big moves. When we zoom in into her things, she really conducted only small moves from this point to this point, from this segment to this segment, and this chain was long. She stopped on some objects, and for each object she was trying to recall something very simple. Triangles, congruent, similarity, talus. She used some schemata from her first class, like we did in the warming up programs at the beginning. Many repetitions, many occurrences of coming back to previously rejected idea. I know that it doesn't work, but after some detour, I come to it more and more. And it can be interpreted with the help of cognitive scientists like an instantiation of so-called cognitive decoupling. This is one of the mechanisms that work when our working memory is not good enough in order to handle the complexity. What was very salient in the case was the opportunistic attention to the ideas of others. Because it's a forum, a synchronous forum, everybody can respond or not respond when she wants and to whom she wants. It wasn't like obligation, like this is a talk at the colloquium. So the norm is that I am talking, you are in silence. It wasn't, or you're asking, I am answering. It was not the same here. It was very free, and they could choose to whom attend, whose advice, with whom to continue to construct the solution, and whose contributions to ignore. The same thing, opportunistic modes, choice of the modes of interaction, and of course persisted in luck. Because all these characterizations that I'm trying to present cannot completely explain the appearance of the solution. Anyway, there is some luck, because some other girls who took part in that forum, they were not less persistent than Maya, but somehow that idea did not emerge. Well, what was I going to say by means of these examples? Maya disappeared sometimes, and it was her individual effort, as far as we know. We've seen interactions with peer problem solvers in a situation where nobody knows which idea is good or not good. It is much subtler. It's something at the level of association. You are saying something, I hear something else. I'll try to elaborate on it. And we still didn't talk about this one, because in the excerpt that they presented, there was not an interaction with the solution source. It was clear that nobody knows. What happened next in the form? This is from Nellie Keller's diary. It was part of her obligations when participating in the project, and she's an amazing writer. They already proved that there is a kite there, parallel lines, and several constructions, but they keep coming back to the same ideas for quite a long period of time. Suddenly, Maya claimed that she had solved the problem. In fact, by suddenly, she had already told for several times that she was close. Everything stops. Several lights and silence. I guess the students question how in many meanings. What is the solution? Why she and not me, or somebody who is known as genius? What if there is a solution at all? Very emotional, loaded reaction, which actually reflects the actual situation at this stage. It was very emotional loaded experience. And this is what happened at the forum itself when Maya announced that she had a solution. I succeed! And the teacher was right. It's so simple that they'd like to die. When I saw that they got nothing from consideration of some idea, I stopped and changed the direction. I went to proportion and solved the problem with several theorems. But anyway, the long way toward the rectangle helped me to prove that something is parallel to something. We cannot follow it now. And this is what helped me with proportion. I analyzed everything and I wrote the solution. The solution is not on the side. She just promises. She just announces that she had. Somebody else, Vera. But I tried a lot of time to find some parallel and it didn't work out. A hint, look at Thaleses in plural. Thanks. Apparently, this thanks didn't help. Merav didn't solve the problem. But somebody else asks question. Alina, how did you prove that KL is parallel to GH and EF? And not Maya, but somebody else in third voice interprets what was Maya probably doing. It is, she used the theorems about tangent lines and triangle similarity. Is it right? Maya, oh, it took years. Just stresses, okay. It can be analyzed in many ways. For a moment, I want to stop on these two blue phrases here. First of all, and solve the problem in several theorems. Have you heard this? Probably it's specifics of Hebrew. I know that in English it sounds really bad, but it's not a problem of translation. It's our attempt to be authentic. In Hebrew, we used to turn many nouns into verbs. So they do not prove congruence of triangles. They congruent triangle. They do not use the theory. The use of the theory is an action. And we've seen examples of this strange use of mathematical words like actions. Every problem-solving tool is an action, and they invent words for these things. And another thing that I'd like to stop for a second is look at Thaleses. No Thaleses in solutions, no Thales, no the theorem of Thales in Maya's solution. It took a lot of time for us to understand, triangulating from several sources, that the intention was proportions. It was her code name for proportions, and it perfectly made sense for some other students. It was confusing to us, but it wasn't confusing to her. And here I thought about myself as a teacher. Of course, in a classroom interaction, normally, when I would hear this, I probably would not stop, but I would correct tactically. So, you mean proportions? Yes, let's continue. Now I'm not sure that it would be a good response because it was perfectly clear for them without my interventions. What I was trying to say by means of the last slide, that Maya became a source of solution and the interaction changed. Before that, when nobody knew, what they were trying to do were to reason together, to disagree, to suggest some ways to contribute equally. But at the moment that Maya, with this I succeed, announced that she had a solution, some other girls stopped thinking independently and began to obtain some hint. It's not a solution. I don't want, don't give me a solution yet. Give me something. And this, what we can see for many times, even in a very progressive mathematics classroom, when a teacher orchestrates discussion. What does it mean? I'm a very constructivist, reform-oriented teacher. I don't tell, I orchestrate. I hear voices of my students, but I give preference to those students who I know they don't, whose contribution is helpful to the forthcoming solution. In this case, students attempt to please the teacher, to say something that the teacher would pick to the next stage. In this case, a presence of a source of authority can be a reason for drastically changing the problem-solving interactions. What I was trying to say? Individual problem-solving, we know a lot about it. The models that work very well in clinical interviews, in labs, and so on and so forth. We have sophisticated analytical systems of categories, how to analyze it. Everything is great. When we're talking about interactions with peers, as I said, it is possible that collaboration can create some synergy of ideas, and it's possible that the collaboration would vary the idea, and this process is quite random if we don't have an outside referee who would help us to sort out which ideas are more or less helpful. And the third thing, the solar shift of attention may occur as a result of a conflict that emerges when more knowledgeable and less knowledgeable interlocutors assign different meanings to the same assertion. The mechanism of interaction, and it is explained very well, I would employ here Anna Svart's terminology, when she talks about commutative conflict, it would be that two people ascribe different meanings to the same word, and in attempt to clarify which meanings are ascribed, they go further. This would be the mechanism of learning when this sort of interaction is available. What I'm trying to say is that if we are talking about instructional settings, we should be aware of the existence of this, and this. And we should employ appropriate theoretical means in order to make sense of very interesting cases that we have in our session. Well, come back to something like, what was the end of this for? 3 different solutions, not just minds. There were really some girls who wanted to solve it independently, and they did. We cannot tell exactly what was the influence of Maya solutions because the ideas are different. But in our research group, this is work of Alva Harris, and I mentioned on the previous slide, we take the same story and try to analyze it with focus on Maya, with focus on Alina, with focus on Shearer, and then to see intersections. This is the way how it's going right now. But there are more happy ends. It's just more complicated than we had the solution, we didn't have the solution. Somebody helped me out to recall several theorems about rectangles, and it was successful, not particularly strong student. Somebody else, Sarah, succeeded to follow the forum. Wow. It was difficult for her to follow the teacher's explanations or be an active member in a regular small group in a classroom setting, but here she followed. That's great. Smadar produced a summary of the ideas to help the rest of the students. Many students were silent observers, silent participants, not observers, but we have evidence that by the end of the forum they understood the solution. So they followed and understood something. And for all students, it was a very strong emotional experience. They talked about it for a month or something like that. One more happy end was related to teacher-parent interactions. Nelly, the teacher, had a conversation with the father of one of my girls at the end of this activity, and that father asked why does my daughter spend long hours by trying to solve some problem instead of studying mathematics? Well, it was a joke at the beginning that I tried to quote, but then we took it seriously and thought that the real process is much more complex and much more multi-dimensional than we try to do even by this confluence model. What can we do about it? And I'll use about 3 minutes and then I finish to say how these long examples of a two-circle problem that I was trying to present is situated in the context of all the project. It is a 3-year project, and what was going on in there. So, just to recall, we wanted to explore authentic long-term processes, problem-solving processes. For this, we needed an environment in which this problem-solving can occur, and we decided to combine classroom and online. For this, we need to somehow to incorporate this online element into teaching of mathematics. For this, we need to accustom students to use this forum not just like a Facebook chat, but for learning purposes. And for this, we need somehow to convince these students to enter the forum and begin working. And it was very difficult to do. A very brief episode. The project began from, I would say, brainwashing. Nelly was talking with parents of the students, with explanation how it would be beneficial for them in light of advanced level of examination that the students are going to take. Everybody was convinced, everyone was perfect, everyone was eager to take part in the project. Let's see what happens. So this problem was the first problem of the project. It was given to these students. And sorry again for spoiling the fun, but there are some not trigonometric solutions to the problem by means of these smart auxiliary constructions. If you discover this one, you have one solution. If you discover that one, this is one solution. It's not our business now to solve this problem, but the problem was quite difficult to the students, but definitely within the reach. It wasn't just some trick that they should invent. Ideas and hints about these possibilities were presented. So, the teacher presented the problem at the lesson and invites students to solve it at the forum. Afternoon, nothing. Evening, nothing. Late evening, one entrance to the forum. And one student, wow, it was our bad dream when somebody solved the problem immediately. Says, I solved it in 5 minutes, no idea. 2 more students, Michael and Karen, enter the forum. Active exchange of ideas. We are happy. Something goes on in the style that we want. The problem is not solved. Okay. Nothing at the forum during the second day. The third day, the teacher meets the students at school and begins talking. We call it now research group. This is a joke about Nelly in the backyard of the school because she really met these students and talked with them very kindly and asked what's going on. And the answer was very natural. They were good students, they were trying to solve the problem, but why to share? They just showed Nelly their drafts of the solution. But they didn't feel comfortable to share something incomplete because this is against the most common norms in the classroom. So Nelly managed to convince them, okay, so just share your draft, just upload to the forum your drafts, it will continue from there. Good. This is what the students did, and in the evening, 8 students have a very good brainstorming based on their drafts, and the problem is solved. The 4th day, the problem is discussed in the classroom. Those who solved the problem on the forum became celebrities, which was very good for the general atmosphere, not only in relation to the project, but at all. What happened next? In 2 months, after that first project, most of the students take part in the forum, some remain silent. And the example that I have shown was from this period. I mean, two-circle problem, the long example with Maya and everybody. So, at this point, for some logistic reasons, we were supposed to leave Facebook and to switch it to Google+. The reason was very simple. Some parents discovered that their girls too much are sitting in Facebook, and somebody was amazed by ads that were on the screen. So it was a big wave of how would I say it? Big wave of unsatisfaction on the part of parents. But Google Plus was good because we didn't see these ads. And the example of to solve the problem was the third problem of the project and the first problem in Google Plus. Everything is great. Everything is flourishing. More and more good discussions. We have tons of data, so on and so forth. The students know now, they do not hesitate to share their drafts and half-baked ideas. We are happy. And then nothing. In about half a year. Well, it was for us so time-intensive and emotionally loaded work that for a moment we thought, okay, what can we do? There is no pedagogical idea that will work forever and for everybody. So, well, we tried. We should think about something else. But what happened is that we didn't take into account that Google Plus is good for adults. And what are doing kids nowadays? So, it's WhatsApp. Just by chance, we discovered that these students, by their initiative, opened a forum at WhatsApp and just forgot to invite their teacher. When it was clear, she politely asked an invitation and got it. And this was our celebration. We got access to their spontaneous exchanges in this WhatsApp without any our intervention. And this was what we wanted. Explorative discourse, sharing ideas, and so on and so forth. What will be next? I don't know. Now I'm very careful, and probably after WhatsApp there will be something else. After one class, we tried more classes. Of course, you'll forgive me if I confess that I presented today the most successful case. I cannot say that it was the same in many classes. And here we have this question, so what? Okay, suggested is some framework that combines several existing frameworks around a chosen theoretical construct of a shift of attention. How can it be helpful? I don't know, but I can share my experience of how does it help me. When we analyzed this data, it was completely clear that as a teacher, nobody can be smart enough in order to plan an optimal way of shifts of attention for the students. Too complicated. And then it was a very natural idea, why should we bother? Probably as teachers, we do not need just to engineer everything. We should create opportunities in which the students would choose which mode of interaction and which course of action is preferable for them. And here, the idea of choice-affluent environments. The term is half borrowed from the field of art education. They talked about choice-based pedagogies. And the quotation is, the student is an artist. In an authentic choice-based environment, students have control over subject matter, materials, and approach. A classroom functions as a studio with different activity centers working in parallel, and students make real choices about in which activity to take part and how. I don't say, solve this problem in 10 minutes, or work on this problem in 10 minutes, and then we'll discuss. Somehow, I give students more freedom to choose with whom interact, how interact, and so on and so forth. Is it possible in mathematics education? Because this is just a translation of this quotation from the field of art education to mathematics education. The student is an artist, the student is a problem solver, so on and so forth. Is it possible to create mathematics classes like this studio in which students have choice what to do, what would be the best for them in order to solve the problem? Well, that forum at Google Plus is probably an example of such a thing. Because they can choose who interact with, when interact with, be silent or be active to share. Okay. It is interesting to think about some dream or generalization from this small example that I presented, that probably as teachers we can think about many problem-solving environments in which students have choice. And if I would review now solution of Maya from this perspective of choices, I tried and counted 6 types of choices that Maya made when she walked on the floor. When I go back to the example of these computations from which I started my talk, this is a tree of choices that were available to that particular students. So they always have some choice, at least a choice to ignore, be engaged, what to do and how. And probably we as teachers should be just aware of these opportunities. This is just a question that I like ask myself when I teach about my lessons. These ideas that I cannot control, that okay, we don't like when the lesson is just a frontal lesson like a lecture. It is not optimal for many students, but probably the lesson in which we say students work in groups and then switch the groups and so on is also not optimal, because we don't know, probably the student needs more or less time or another type of interaction that we can suggest. And this is why I like asking myself all these questions about my lessons in terms of choices. I'm telling stories, and of course, a reasonable question is, can these successful cases of problem-solving environments in classes be somehow upscaled? Well, we were trying to think about it, and so far we feel that more confluence is needed. Additional theories, additional insights are needed in order to make the thing work. One of them is, we tried it with Nelly Carroll in our further work. We tried to explain participation or the lack of participation of the students in problem-solving forum in terms of Everett Rogers' theory of diffusion of innovation. This is a theory from sociology that takes into account that when you introduce something new, there are more or less standard stages and more or less standard actions and actors. At some moment, this story, nothing in the forum, nothing in the forum, 2 students in the forum, 8 students in the forum, nothing in the forum. All this story, it was convenient to us to tell with reference to Everett Rogers, but this is just one candidate. It becomes more and more complicated when we really try to make things work in a realistic situation. So that's why I think that even though I'm very capable with my research group, I'm very proud that so many excellent people are interested, I think that our future is citizen science. I think that if we work for improving something in mathematics education, mathematics teachers are not less interested than us to do something good. And that's why I hope that my next project will be the project when teachers will help me with analyzing, with collecting and analyzing data about their studies. This is probably the most sad reflection of, I think, a successful project, because to analyze the story of Maya, the story of Shira, and 8 more episodes and 3 additional classes, it's a full-time job for 6 people. And anyway, after all this, we can just tell stories. We can tell more successful story, less successful story. If we want to see some more general regularities, we should somehow change the paradigm, and at this moment, I'm optimistic about the potential of citizen science, but what will be tomorrow, who knows? Thank you very much. Do we have some time for questions?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
So when you were sharing some of the things about the different choices that the students had available to them in the classroom, that immediately called to mind questions of how they were being assessed. I think often students' choices are influenced by ways they're being assessed. How were they being evaluated on this, or were they at all?
To talk about evaluation, we should agree first what counts for happy end. If a particular configuration leads, if we agree that happy end is a correct solution to a given problem. If we agree on this criterion, let's experiment with some configurations of choices and see in which configuration of choices more students independently arrive at the idea. But if we open this criteria, and I didn't use the word learning for problem solving throughout the lecture, but we can introduce very diverse criterion of what counts for learning. In this case, we can reconfigure our choices, but again have indicators of some kind of success. The aspect of the project that I didn't talk about was related to the long-term development of particular focus students through the theories of these activities, and there we choose as a criteria of success so-called heuristic behaviors. It is a technical term that I'm not going to introduce now, but let's say that roughly speaking, if the students didn't know how to solve this problem and didn't know how to solve that problem, but here he persisted more time and heuristic search was more diverse, we are happy. This is one of the criteria of learning, and the question how to assess is related directly to this. I don't think that a formal assessment, that is, we analyze this forum and would like to transform it into a number, a grade, would be in spirit of this activity. Not everything should be
I have a question regarding the two lower parts you have in your model. So you have the peer problem solvers, and on the other hand side, someone who already has the solution at hand and might give a cue like Maya for
someone or somebody. It can be an access to the Google platform, to Google, to internet, to that.
My question is, perhaps person A has not solved the task, but gives a hint in the Google Plus, which for someone else might be a solution hint. I mean, as you said, problems are very relative, and I think can be very hard to figure out, is it like only a peer problem solver, or is it like a solution source? Do you get my point?
So you mean that there's some methodological issue if you really want to separate and say that this part of the problem solving process is driven by, belongs to this rectangle and this one belongs to this rectangle. True.
Okay.
But this is not what we're trying to do. This scheme is our reflection on the observation that knowledge about somebody has the solution changes interactions and heuristic search.
Yeah.
We felt that the regular splitting into individual and collaborative is not enough to capture the phenomenon they observe. In collaborative, they do different things, being convinced that somebody knows more than you, or being convinced that nobody knows more than me, and we can work together. This is just this thing. I worked once on, I was once very interested in questions, how these smart guys invent these smart problems for mathematics competition. And I was very happy that Igor Kontorovich, Dr. Igor Kontorovich now at Oakland, took his line of research as his PhD study. And in one of the interviews, he, with a mathematician, a very recognized mathematician who sometimes proposes problem for International Mathematical Olympiad, he was told that, well, I do my research and sometimes I have this particular case, and I think that this case is simple enough to turn it into Olympiad problem. And Igor asked him, so, but you worked on this case for 2 weeks. How can you offer it as a problem for 3 hours? The answer was, but I didn't know that the solution existed. And they know, just because of the format of Olympiad. It's very important, the presence of the source of knowledge or
I'll ask one question and then apologize for having to run. How do you know when it's profitable to shift attention? Because you're saying the key solution idea comes from a shift of attention, but I've also seen people who were almost there shift attention and lose what was profitable. So that there's the meta question of if you're a problem solver or a problem solving group, how much do you persevere and when do you decide to shift attention?
It's just a law of nature. Shifts of attention occur. I don't think about this in terms of more profitable, less profitable. And indeed, we know a lot of cases when somebody was so close to the solution but didn't know about it and then he shifted to something else. Well, if it is an exercise in persistence, it's probably good. But if it is some more standard instructional situation, as a teacher, at that moment, I would probably choose to give him a hint that would retain his attention at this moment here. So as a solver, I don't know what is profitable. As an observer, I do, if I know the solution, if I am a source of knowledge about the solution. And then as a teacher, if I'm aware of all these things, I can choose to let him go to something else and fail, or to stop him here, or to creating an interaction with somebody else who still thinks about this direction, and then to retain and succeed in this case. So I think that your question is a question from observer's point of view, not from the point of view of the solver herself. As a solver, I don't know is it profitable.
Well, it's both. Because on the one hand, as a teacher, I agree with your response, but you know the space. And the question then is, as a solver, what strategies do I have for making my way through that space? And I have to grapple with precisely those kinds of questions of, do I pursue this? When do I back off? When do I try something else? When do I return? We'll continue talking about this when we
It
get
is
there.
about, again, these relative values about all the skills, but we know that all this is about increasing chances. We can never, again, we cannot transform all problems to exercises because they're not interesting at all. Thank you.
Question. So if you think not only about the key solution idea, but just key idea, so is it so important that this idea led to the solution of the problem? Or is it important to know that some ideas, maybe even mistakes are come from interaction with peer problem solver, something with a solution source, and some from individual effort. But by making this mechanism more explicit to this problem solver, is it so the question, do we need the word solution there, or maybe just idea? Because some intuitions are very important, even if they are wrong.
Well, this is a distinction between heuristic idea and one of them, which is tagged as key solution idea. I think, if I understand correctly, that what you're describing is heuristic idea. I'm trying something and you can help. It is related to intuition. But as a focus of our study, we've chosen those moments when I feel that I saw. It's like insight, but it's not insight. Insight is a psychological phenomenon. And solution idea is mathematical. I can say that this mathematical idea was preceded to insight.
But can it be like in this case that I solved? No, I don't. Because she has this key solution. She thought that this is a key solution.
After a while.
After a while.
In the definition given, it is, okay, I stop my heuristic search here. I have the idea. Probably tomorrow I'll reconsider and say that the problem is wrong. But for now, it is a key solution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.